The temperature outside Ezra McClanahan's cabin had dropped to 8 degrees below zero, and the fire in his cylindrical iron stove had been dead for 9 hours. Yet when his neighbor, Silas Pruitt, pressed his palm against the massive brick wall inside at dawn, he yanked his hand back from heat that felt like midday summer sun on stone. Before we see how one Appalachian farmer's obsession with warmth changed frontier heating forever, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten mountain ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The cold came down from the peaks like something alive. January of 1849 brought temperatures to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina that old-timers swore they had never seen before. Inside his cabin, Ezra McClanahan woke for the 4th time that night and knew immediately the fire had died too low. The air against his face felt sharp enough to cut. He swung his legs out from under the quilts and felt the shock of the dirt floor against his bare feet. The packed earth was cold as stone. Across the single room, his wife Nora slept with their 3 children pulled close against her. The oldest boy, Thomas, age 9, the middle girl, Sarah, age 6, and Abigail, just 4 years old, whose small form was barely visible beneath the mounded blankets. Ezra crossed to the stone fireplace and knelt before it. A few weak coals glowed in the ash. He added kindling, blew gently until flames caught, then stacked split oak logs in a careful structure. The fire built slowly. He held his hands toward the heat and tried to remember what time he had woken last. Midnight, maybe. 2 hours of sleep at most before the cold pulled him awake again. This was the pattern all winter. Every 2 hours through the darkness, he rose to feed the fire. If he slept longer than that, the cabin temperature dropped toward freezing. The stone fireplace threw heat into the room when the fire burned strong. But the moment the flames died down, that heat vanished up the chimney or escaped through gaps in the log walls. Nothing held it. Nothing stored it. Ezra was a trapper by trade, running lines through the mountain forests for beaver and fox. The work was hard and the income modest, but it fed his family. They lived simply in this one-room cabin he had built 5 years earlier, dirt floor because he could not afford planks, one window because glass was expensive, a table, 2 benches, a single bed where all 5 of them slept. He returned to bed and pulled the quilts over himself. Nora stirred slightly, but did not wake. Ezra closed his eyes and tried to find sleep again, knowing he would wake in 2 more hours when the fire died and the cold returned. He woke to Nora shaking his shoulder, her voice urgent and afraid. "Ezra, Ezra, something's wrong with Abigail." He was on his feet before he fully understood. Dawn light filtered gray through the window. The fire was dead. The cabin interior was brutally cold, and Abigail was making a sound he had never heard before, a wet, rattling cough that seemed to come from deep in her chest. Nora had the child wrapped in every blanket they owned, but Abigail's small face was pale, and her lips had a faint blue tinge that made Ezra's stomach drop. "The fire went out," Nora said. "I don't know when. I woke and it was so cold, and she was coughing." Ezra moved fast. He rebuilt the fire with shaking hands, feeding it until flames roared. He brought the blanket-wrapped bundle of his daughter close to the hearth. Abigail's cough continued, her small body shuddering with each breath. The cabin slowly warmed. After an hour, Abigail's color improved. The cough eased. By mid-morning, she was sleeping normally. But Ezra could not stop thinking about those blue lips, about how quickly the cold had moved in when the fire died, about how close they had come to something much worse. That afternoon, while Nora tended the children and the fire burned strong again, Ezra stood looking at the stone fireplace. He had built it himself using creek stones and mud mortar. It worked adequately when fire burned in it. But the moment the fire died, all the heat disappeared. The stones stayed cold. The cabin stayed cold. "There must be a way," he said aloud to the empty room. There must be a way to hold heat when I cannot stay awake. Spring came to the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1849 with slow reluctance. Snow melted from the peaks in muddy streams, wildflowers pushed through the forest floor, and Ezra McClanahan began an obsession that would consume him for months. He started by watching how heat behaved. When Nora cooked their evening meal over the outdoor fire pit, Ezra noticed the stones surrounding the flames. He touched them carefully after the fire died. The stones stayed warm for hours while the ash around them went cold. He placed his hand above a stone and felt heat radiating upward like invisible light. He began testing different materials. River stones held warmth longer than wood. Clay from the creek bed stayed warm even longer than river stones. Iron heated faster than anything, but also cooled fastest. He kept notes in his mind, building a framework of understanding without formal education to guide him. In late April, a traveling stonemason named Angus Drummond arrived in the valley to work on a church foundation in the nearest town, 12 miles from Ezra's cabin. Ezra rode down to watch the man work, and over the course of 3 days, he asked questions that must have seemed strange to Angus. "Why do you use such thick stones for the foundation?" "Because thick stone holds the building steady," Angus replied. "And because once stone gets cold in winter or warm in summer, it stays that way for a good long while. Heavy things that heat slow, cool slow. Light things heat fast, cool fast." Ezra thought about this for a long moment. So if a man wanted something to soak up heat and give it back slowly, he would want something heavy. Angus looked at him curiously. "I suppose so. What are you heating?" "My family," Ezra said. He rode home with an idea forming. What if he built something heavy inside his cabin, something that could soak up heat all evening from a fire, then give that heat back through the long night? Not a fireplace that let warmth escape up a chimney, but a solid mass that would hold the heat like clay holds water. But what material? And what shape? He could pile stones inside his cabin, but they would be irregular, unstable, full of gaps where heat would escape. He needed something uniform, something that could stack tightly and create a solid wall of heat-holding material. The answer came to him one morning while watching Nora shape clay around the fire pit to contain the flames. Bricks. Fired clay bricks, all the same size, stackable, capable of being joined with mortar into a seamless mass. He had seen brick buildings in town. He knew bricks could be made by hand if a man had clay and time and willingness to work. The question was whether he had the knowledge to make enough bricks to matter, and whether bricks positioned near a fire would actually hold heat the way he imagined. There was only one way to find out. Summer heat settled over the mountains, and Ezra spent every spare moment refining his concept. His first idea was simple: pile stones inside the cabin near the fireplace. But when he stacked creek stones against the cabin wall as a test, he saw the problem immediately. The irregular shapes left gaps everywhere. Air moved through those gaps. Heat would escape through them just as easily. His second idea involved building a wall from clay mud, packed solid and allowed to dry. He built a small version outside the cabin, 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It cracked within a week as it dried, deep fissures running through the clay that would leak air and heat. Worse, he realized a wall that size made from wet clay would be impossibly heavy and would never support its own weight as it dried. The breakthrough came in early July when he made a 2-day journey to the nearest town of any size. He walked the streets studying buildings, paying particular attention to anything made from brick: a merchant store, a bank, a warehouse. The bricks were uniform, precisely the same size, stacked in neat courses with thin mortar joints between them. The walls were solid, flat, and clearly strong enough to support tremendous weight. Ezra stood outside the bank for nearly an hour, examining the brickwork. Each brick was roughly 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches tall. Thousands of them formed the building's walls. He tried to calculate how many bricks he would need for a wall inside his cabin. A wall 10 feet tall, 9 feet wide, 8 inches thick. The numbers overwhelmed him, but he estimated somewhere between 500 and 600 bricks. He could not afford to buy that many. The cost would exceed anything he could earn in 2 years of trapping. But he had noticed something else in town, a brickyard where men made bricks by hand. He watched them work for an afternoon. They dug clay from a pit, mixed it with sand and water, packed it into wooden molds, turned the formed bricks out onto boards to dry in the sun, then fired them in a large kiln. The process was labor-intensive, but not complicated. A man with access to clay, wood for molds, and time could make his own bricks. Ezra returned home and immediately began searching his property for clay. He found it along the creek bed that ran through the valley below his cabin. The clay was reddish-brown, sticky when wet, and had the right plastic quality he had seen at the brickyard. He dug a sample and took it back to the cabin. But he also realized something else. His stone fireplace would not work for what he envisioned. Fireplaces were designed to vent heat up and out. He needed something that would concentrate heat in one direction, toward the wall he planned to build. He needed a stove, and not just any stove. He needed one designed to radiate heat efficiently in all directions. Late summer of 1849 marked the beginning of the hardest physical labor Ezra had ever undertaken. He started by building wooden molds from scrap lumber, carefully measuring each one to produce bricks 8 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches tall. The precision mattered. If the bricks varied in size, they would not stack properly. He dug clay from the creek bed, hauling it up the slope to his cabin in wooden buckets. The clay was heavy, and each bucket weighed close to 40 pounds when full. He mixed the clay with sand and water in a large wooden trough, working it with his hands until the consistency felt right. Too wet, and the bricks would slump when removed from the molds. Too dry, and the clay would not pack properly. The molding process became a rhythm. Pack clay into the mold, pressing it firmly into the corners. Scrape excess clay from the top with a flat stick. Turn the mold over onto a wooden board and tap it until the formed brick released. Carry the board to the drying area he had cleared in the sun. Repeat. He could produce 12 bricks per day, working from sunrise to sunset. Each brick needed 4 to 5 days to dry in the sun before it was hard enough to handle. Then came firing. Ezra built a temporary kiln from creek stones and mud, large enough to fire 30 bricks at a time. He stacked the dried bricks inside with small gaps between them for heat circulation, then built a fire beneath and around the kiln that he maintained for 18 to 20 hours. The firing transformed the clay. Bricks went into the kiln dull and fragile. They came out hard, ringing like pottery when tapped, capable of bearing tremendous weight. But not every brick survived. Some cracked from uneven heating. Others warped. Ezra rejected anything about them that was not near perfect. His neighbors noticed. Silas Pruitt rode past one afternoon and saw hundreds of bricks drying in neat rows beside the cabin. He reined his horse and stared. "You making bricks now, Ezra?" Silas called. "Gonna build a mansion on that dirt floor?" Ezra looked up from his work but said nothing. Silas shook his head and rode on, and Ezra returned to packing clay into molds. The work consumed August and September. His hands became raw from handling wet clay. His back ached from bending over the molds and hauling buckets. Nora helped when she could, carrying water or watching the kiln fires. The children stacked dried bricks, making a game of building towers that Ezra carefully disassembled each evening. By late October, he had 596 usable bricks stacked and ready. The first snow of the season dusted the peaks. And the cylindrical iron stove he had ordered with the last of his fur money arrived by wagon from town, its dark metal surface cold and smooth. Ezra stood looking at his stockpile of bricks and the stove, knowing winter was coming and his real work was about to begin. Early November brought cold mornings, and the realization that Ezra faced a problem he had not fully considered. Standard mud mortar would not work for what he was building. He learned this the hard way when he joined 2 test bricks with creek mud and clay, let the mortar dry, then heated the bricks over a fire. Within minutes, the mortar cracked. The thermal expansion of the heated bricks exceeded what the mud could tolerate. He needed mortar that could withstand extreme heat without cracking, mortar that would remain flexible enough to accommodate the expansion and contraction of bricks heating and cooling day after day, season after season. Angus Drummond visited in mid-November, curious about the brick pile he had heard about from passing travelers. Ezra explained his problem, and Angus nodded slowly. "You need lime mortar," Angus said. "Burn limestone to quicklime, mix it with sand. That's what holds together under heat." "I don't have limestone nearby," Ezra replied. "Then you have a problem." But Ezra spent the next 3 days searching, ranging farther from his cabin than he normally traveled. He found what he needed 2 miles west, a limestone outcrop exposed on a hillside where erosion had cut through the soil. The stone was gray-white and brittle enough to break with a hammer. He spent a week quarrying limestone, carrying chunks back to his cabin. Then he built a small lime kiln from creek stones, stacking limestone inside and building a fire beneath it that he maintained for 3 full days. The heat drove off carbon dioxide from the limestone, leaving behind quicklime, a caustic, powdery substance that burned skin on contact. Ezra handled the quicklime carefully, mixing it with sand in different ratios. 3 parts lime to 2 parts sand produced mortar that was too brittle. 2 parts lime to 3 parts sand was too weak. He finally settled on 3 parts lime, 2 parts sand, and 1 part clay for binding. He tested this mixture by mortaring stones together and heating them repeatedly over his fire. The mortar held without significant cracking. By late November, he was ready to begin wall construction. He cleared space inside the cabin, moving the bed and table to create room along one wall. He leveled the dirt floor where the wall would stand, tamping the earth solid with a wooden post. Then he laid flat creek stones as a foundation base, creating a level surface for the first course of bricks. He positioned the thin, dark stone platform where his stove would sit, finding a perfect flat piece of creek stone roughly 2 inches thick. The platform sat precisely where the wall would rise behind it. He calculated the wall dimensions one final time: 10 feet tall, 9 feet wide, 8 inches thick, approximately 560 bricks. That evening, he mixed his first batch of lime mortar and laid the first course of bricks on the foundation stones. The white mortar contrasted sharply with the reddish-brown clay. He worked carefully, checking level with a straight edge, adjusting each brick until it sat perfectly. By nightfall, the first course was complete. The wall had begun. Mid-November of 1849 marked the beginning of wall construction in earnest. Ezra worked methodically, rising before dawn and laboring until darkness made it impossible to see the level of his work. Each day he laid 3 to 4 courses of bricks, moving slowly to ensure precision. His technique became ritual: butter the ends of each brick with white lime mortar using a flat wooden trowel. Set the brick against the previous one, pressing firmly. Check the level with a straight edge. Tap the brick gently with the trowel handle until it sat perfectly aligned. Scrape excess mortar from the joints. Move to the next brick. Every third course he checked the walls plumb by hanging a weighted string from the top and measuring the distance to the wall, face at multiple points. Any deviation meant removing bricks and relaying them. The wall had to be perfectly vertical, or the weight of upper courses would create instability. The wall rose slowly, 2 feet after the first week, 4 feet after 2 weeks. The white mortar joints created horizontal lines across the reddish-brown brick face, giving the wall a striped appearance. As the wall grew taller, the physical challenge increased. Ezra built a temporary scaffold from split logs, standing on it to reach higher courses. Nora watched him work one afternoon and finally, asked the question that had been troubling her. Why so thick? Why not save bricks and make it thinner? Ezra set down a brick and looked at her. Thickness holds more heat. 8 inches of brick can soak up a whole evening's fire and give it back slowly through the night. 4 inches would heat faster, but cool faster too. I need the mass. She nodded slowly, though he could see doubt in her eyes. Everyone doubted. Silas Pruitt and his brother Tobias had visited during construction, their skepticism plain. "You're building a wall that doesn't hold up a roof, doesn't keep out wind," Tobias had said, shaking his head. "Just sits there, inside your cabin." "It'll hold heat," Ezra had replied quietly. "That's what it's for." The wall reached ceiling height by early December. 10 feet tall, 9 feet wide, a massive presence dominating the cabin's interior. Ezra laid the final bricks carefully, finishing the top course with the same precision he had used on the bottom. The mortar needed 2 weeks to fully cure before he could subject it to heat. While the mortar cured, Ezra positioned the cylindrical iron stove on its thin stone platform. This was the critical measurement. He used a marked stick to measure the distance from the stove's back surface to the wall face. 4 inches exactly. He tested it 3 times, adjusting the stove position slightly each time until the gap was uniform from floor to ceiling. Too close and heat could not flow properly up the narrow channel. Too far and heat would escape sideways. Wasted. 4 inches was the balance point he had calculated. The system was complete. The massive brick wall stood ready. The cylindrical stove sat positioned precisely before it. Now came the waiting, and then the test. December 20th, 1849. The mortar had cured for 2 full weeks. Evening temperatures were dropping to 18 degrees outside. Ezra's family gathered inside the cabin, watching with a mixture of hope and anxiety as he prepared to test the system for the first time. Ezra loaded the cylindrical stove with split oak dense hardwood that would burn hot and long. He had chosen the wood carefully, rejecting softer pine in favor of the hardest fuel he could find. He arranged the logs to allow air circulation, then lit kindling at the base. The fire caught quickly. He closed the single arched iron door partway, controlling the draft. The stove heated rapidly, its cylindrical body beginning to radiate warmth in all directions. Within 30 minutes, Ezra could feel intense heat, standing 3 feet away. He moved to the narrow gap behind the stove, the 4-inch channel between hot iron and brick wall. When he held his hand in that space, he felt a strong upward rush of air. Hot air rising, pulling cooler air from below, creating a convection current that bathed the brick wall in continuous heat flow. After 1 hour, he touched the brick wall surface carefully. It was warm, but not yet hot. After 2 hours, the wall was noticeably warmer, heat penetrating into the brick mass. After 3 hours, the wall surface was hot enough that he could only hold his hand against it for 2 seconds before pulling away. The bricks were absorbing thermal energy exactly as he had hoped. Ezra let the fire burn down naturally, adding no more wood. By 9 in the evening, the fire had reduced to glowing coals. By 10, the coals had died and the stove was cooling. The family went to bed, uncertainty filling the cabin like a presence. Ezra lay awake in the darkness, anxiety building with each passing hour. What if the wall cooled too quickly? What if 3 months of labor and his entire year's income had produced nothing but an expensive pile of bricks inside his cabin? At midnight he rose and crossed to the wall. In the darkness, he placed both palms against the brick surface. The wall was very warm, almost hot. Relief flooded through him, but he forced himself to remain cautious. Midnight was only 2 hours after the fire died. The real test would come at dawn. He checked again at 2 in the morning. The wall was still warm, cooler than midnight, but radiating noticeable heat. At 4, the same. At 6, with dawn light beginning to filter through the window, he touched the wall again and felt warmth still emanating from the bricks. When the family woke at 7, the cabin interior was comfortable. Outside temperature had dropped to 12 degrees overnight. Inside, without a fire burning for 9 hours, the temperature felt close to 55 degrees. Nora crossed to the wall and placed her hand against it. She looked at Ezra, tears forming in her eyes. "It works," she whispered. "It actually works." Winter of 1849 into 1850 became a season of refinement and discovery. Ezra spent weeks learning the optimal way to operate his heating system, testing different burning patterns until he found the technique that maximized heat retention. He discovered that dense hardwood burned in a hot, fast fire for 2.5 hours charged the wall to its maximum capacity. Slow-burning fires that lasted longer actually heated the wall less efficiently because lower temperatures meant less thermal energy transfer. The cylindrical stove needed to reach high temperatures quickly, radiating intense heat that the brick mass could absorb deeply. Once properly charged, the wall radiated warmth for 12 full hours before the cabin cooled to uncomfortable levels. Ezra timed it repeatedly, always getting the same result. A fire burning from 7 in the evening until 9:30 charged the wall enough to keep the cabin warm until 9:30 the following morning. The fuel savings astonished him. Previously, he had burned wood continuously through the night, waking every 2 hours to feed the fire. Now he burned one evening fire and slept through until dawn. His firewood consumption dropped by approximately 40% compared to previous winters. As weeks passed, he noticed changes in the wall itself. Dark staining began appearing on certain bricks, particularly at the height where the stove's heat concentrated most intensely. These bricks darkened from reddish-brown to deep charcoal, sometimes nearly black. The staining proved where heat absorption was greatest, creating a visible map of thermal patterns. Ezra studied these patterns and made a small adjustment, shifting the stove position slightly to distribute heat more evenly across the wall surface. The modification worked. New dark patches appeared on previously unstained bricks. Family life transformed in ways both obvious and subtle. Everyone slept through the night without interruption. Nora no longer woke to frozen water in the bucket by morning. The children were healthier, suffering fewer colds and coughs. But more than physical comfort, there was a psychological shift. The constant low-level anxiety about staying warm, about the fire dying, about freezing in the night, all of it disappeared. Nora said it best one morning in late January. "I didn't realize how tired I was until I could finally sleep through a winter night." Word spread slowly through the isolated mountain community. Trappers and farmers lived miles apart, but news traveled through chance encounters on trails, conversations at the trading post, stories shared during rare social gatherings. People heard that Ezra McClanahan had built something inside his cabin that kept his family warm all night without tending a fire. Some neighbors remained skeptical despite the reports. Silas Pruitt was particularly dismissive when asked about it. "Sure, Ezra's cabin stays warm, probably just built better logs. That brick wall's got nothing to do with it. Man wasted 3 months building something that just sits there, taking up space." Then came the cold snap in late January. Temperatures plunged to 8 degrees below zero and stayed there for 3 nights. Ezra's system faced its hardest test. He burned his fire slightly longer each evening, 3 full hours instead of 2.5. The wall responded by holding heat through the brutal nights. The cabin never dropped below 48 degrees. His neighbors suffered differently. February of 1850 brought a winter storm that old-timers would talk about for decades. The blizzard swept down from the high peaks on a Monday morning, bringing wind that howled like something wounded and temperatures that dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Snow fell so thick that a man could not see 10 feet in front of his face. Ezra had prepared. He had split extra firewood and stacked it inside the cabin near the stove. When the storm hit, he simply maintained his normal routine. That evening, he burned his fire for 3 hours, feeding split oak into the cylindrical stove until the iron glowed faint red and the brick wall behind it absorbed heat until the surface was almost too hot to touch. The family went to sleep while wind screamed outside and snow piled against the cabin walls. The fire died around 10 in the evening. The wall radiated warmth through the night. By morning, snow had drifted to the cabin eaves, making it impossible to open the door. They were trapped inside, but they were warm. The storm continued through Tuesday. Ezra burned another evening fire. The wall charged again and held heat through. The second night. Wednesday brought no relief. The blizzard raged on, wind driving snow horizontal across the mountains. Ezra's indoor firewood supply was running low. He made the decision to conserve, burning a smaller fire Wednesday evening, only 2 hours instead of 3. He worried the wall would not charge sufficiently for the brutal night ahead, but there was no choice. The family slept, and Ezra woke periodically to check the temperature. The wall performed. Even with less charging time, it kept the cabin at 45 degrees through the night. Thursday morning, the storm finally broke. Sunlight emerged, brilliant on fresh snow. Ezra dug out the door and stepped into a transformed landscape. Snow reached past his knees. The entire valley lay buried under white drifts that sparkled in the winter sun. He thought immediately of his neighbors. He made his way to Silas Pruitt's cabin, a difficult journey through deep snow. What he found there troubled him deeply. Silas's family had survived, but barely. Their fire had gone out during the second night when they ran out of accessible firewood. The woodpile was buried under snow, and they could not dig it out in the blizzard. The cabin interior had dropped below freezing. 2 of Silas's children had frostbite on their fingers from sleeping in those temperatures. His wife was sick from exposure, wrapped in blankets and shivering, despite the fire Silas had rebuilt Thursday morning. Tobias Pruitt's family told a similar story. They had kept their fire going through all 3 nights, but the effort had been brutal. Someone had to stay awake constantly to feed wood. They had burned through an entire month's supply of firewood in 3 days. Everyone was exhausted, faces hollow from lack of sleep and constant cold. The following day, Silas came to Ezra's cabin. He found the family comfortable, healthy, well-rested. The contrast was impossible to ignore. "How?" Silas asked simply. Ezra showed him. He placed Silas's hand against the brick wall. The fire had been out for nearly 12 hours, yet the wall was still warm to the touch. Silas stared at the darkened, heat-stained bricks, at the white mortar joints, at the cylindrical stove positioned exactly 4 inches from the wall face. His skepticism shattered like ice under a hammer. "This is still warm. Your fire's been dead since last night." "The brick holds heat like a pond holds water," Ezra said quietly. Spring of 1850 arrived, and Silas Pruitt came to Ezra asking to learn how to build a thermal mass wall. Ezra agreed without hesitation. Through April and May, he taught Silas everything: how to find good clay, mold bricks, build a firing kiln, formulate lime mortar that would withstand thermal stress, lay courses with precision, and most critically, how to position a stove at exactly 4 inches from the wall face. Silas's wall was completed by autumn, the first time he burned his evening fire and woke 12 hours later to a warm cabin. He rode to Ezra's place just to shake his hand. Word spread through Appalachian communities the way news always traveled in isolated regions, slowly, person to person, across ridges and valleys. Over the next 5 years, dozens of heat-keeper walls appeared across the Blue Ridge and Smoky Mountains. Some builders used stone instead of brick when clay was scarce. Some built smaller walls when they could not produce 600 bricks. The results varied, but the core principles remained constant: thermal mass behind a stove, an air gap for convection, quality mortar. The phrase McClanahan's 12-hour wall entered the local vocabulary as a standard of quality and function. By 1855, Ezra was 44 years old with 7 children. His original wall still functioned perfectly after 6 years. The heat staining had deepened to nearly black, where thermal exposure was most intense. Some bricks showed slight surface cracking from repeated expansion and contraction, but the structure remained sound. The lime mortar held without failure. Ezra's life continued quietly, trapping, farming, raising children, helping neighbors who asked about his heating system. He never sought recognition or profit. When asked why he shared his technique freely, his answer was simple. Coal doesn't care about money. Anyone trying to keep their family alive through mountain winter deserves to know what works. The Civil War brought disruption in the 1860s. Men left for armies. Families fled. But cabins with thermal mass walls remained, some becoming shelters for displaced people. The walls kept saving lives, even when the men who built them were gone. Ezra McClanahan died in 1873 at 62 in his cabin, surrounded by family. He was buried in a small mountain cemetery under a simple marker with his name and dates. The stone made no mention of the wall or the innovation he had shared. His cabin remained standing, occupied by his eldest son's family. The brick wall still functioned after 24 years. The darkened bricks, white mortar joints, thin stone platform, the 4-inch gap, all unchanged. Modern heating systems spread through the mountains in later decades, making thermal mass walls less necessary. Some were torn down, others remained as curiosities, their purpose half forgotten. In winter of 1897, Ezra's great-grandson, age 8, pressed his hand against the brick wall his great-grandfather had built 48 years earlier. The wall was still warm from the morning fire, still radiating heat, as winter dusk fell. The boy knew only that great-grandpa built this, and it kept them warm. The knowledge was fading, but the wall remained. Silent, dark-stained, warm. A monument not to glory, but to one man's refusal to let his family freeze. The impossible made routine, brick by brick, generation after generation.